Hey there friends, it's Codiak and Livid coming at you in stereo for our first of many Outriders tier list videos. We had a lot of fun putting these together for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and we thought we'd try our luck again here in Outriders. Now, a couple things I want to make sure we are very clear about right off the bat. The rankings that we're going to talk about are based on our opinions, but we're going to do our best to explain exactly why each weapon got the ranking that it did, providing you with more than just surface level information and drilling down into why these weapons are good or why they aren't.
That's right, and we'll have a few different factors that we want you to be thinking about the entire time we're going through this list, because they're the foundation for our entire ranking system. So we're going to be focusing on the weapon itself. Don't forget you can only change one mod in crafting, not both. So the weapon is still a big factor. And we're also going to talk about the tier 3 mod and how valuable it is at base power level. We'll also take that a step further and talk about the versatility that the tier 3 weapon mod has and how it influences the moment-to-moment gameplay. Each item is also judged based on how good it is in a solo environment versus a co-op environment. And finally, we'll focus on the weapon in different scenarios, being used against trash mobs, elites, and bosses.
Now, of course, this is just a baseline. We're going to be talking about other aspects of each gun, but this is a good starting point, and it's okay to have different opinions or disagree with us. If you do, let us know in the comment section and we'll get a discussion going. You all may bring different opinions to the table, and that completely changes the way we talk and think about these weapons, so don't be afraid to speak up. And with that being said, let's dive in to our first weapon. Now, at the D tier, we've got the Grim Marrow. This is an interesting light machine gun, and I think if you played the demo for any stretch of time, you know why this weapon is down here at the D rank. A lot of it has to do with the fact that Singularity is broken. It doesn't quite work the way it should, and while it is an interesting weapon, having a nice tier 3 mod, it's not perfect. And I think Livid can dive a little bit more into why it's not quite that good.
First of all, I think light machine guns overall lack a bit of, on the damage side of things, they don't really do tons of damage. It's kind of hard to focus in on elite enemies and stuff like really reliably, right? There's other weapons that definitely hit that damage tier, and they're probably going to be more meta for what it's at. So already it's like kind of a weapon that's not great in a lot of scenarios. Also, on top of that, even though the Singularity mod is bugged, it looks like there is still going to be like an internal cooldown on this sort of thing, so you're not going to be proccing this ability across a ton of mobs all at once, and that could really hamper its overall effectiveness against, trash mobs. I don't see this being really effective against elite mobs because it has to, detonate on one of the mobs you're already hitting, right? So against an elite target, if it's the only elite target, you're not really doing much against it. And the same thing goes for bosses. So it kind of just overall doesn't really feel great against most of the targets. And, even once it gets fixed, it probably will not be still proccing as much as we want it to.
Right, it's a really hard mod to control because you have to control what target you kill it on, and if you kill the wrong target and the anomaly spawns in a random section of the map, then it's useless, and then it's just a light machine gun.
And we all know, like I said, the light machine guns, they're not great. I think they're best used, just light machine guns in general, are for applying status effects because they have such high ammo reserves and it allows you to just get those things off on multiple targets. So I don't think this is the best weapon to have this sort of mod that's really focused on blowing up groups of enemies.
Right, and the reason why it's not an F tier weapon is because its tier 2 mod, Improved Stiffening, does give you a little utility. It inflicts a slow on your enemies. That is pretty valuable. And light machine guns in general are good in both solo and team play, and they're effective in boss fights, they're effective at trash mobs, but it's really that tier 3 mod that I want to focus on because it's just not that good, which is why it gets the D rank. And hopefully we'll see an improvement. I know they are going to be working on the Grim Marrow for launch, but it's hard to think that it's going to be that much better once it does get a pass.
So the next one I think that we should talk about, and we've kind of pulled this one at C tier because we don't really know how this is all going to work out with other weapons, but it would be the Torment and Agony, the only example we have so far of like legendary pistols, right? And they have a really awesome tier 3 mod called Judgment Enforcer. And what this does is as you shoot enemies, you'll essentially mark them. And when you reload your weapon, it'll deal 5 times your weapon's damage to every marked enemy all at once, right? So the marks are removed if you change your weapon at any time during that, but it allows you to get some value at blowing up enemies in between your actual damage points, right? But it also allows you to just make really good use of your ammo to just tag certain enemies, and then you get that big burst of damage all at once. So I think that's like a really awesome mod in itself that will be good for a lot of different variety of weapons.
right? And just drilling down on the math here for a second. So 5 times your weapon damage at this point, before anything has been improved or upgraded, is around 60 damage when you reload your weapon on those marked targets. That's not a bad chunk of change. Of course, there's also that tier 1 mod, Clip Combustion, where reloading your weapon creates a shockwave, dealing a little bit of damage to enemies within a 5-meter radius. Now, that's a really interesting mod because it's dependent on your location as a player. You can control where that damage goes out, but if you're not the type of player that likes to be in the middle of enemies, then you're not going to see a lot of value there. So it's not a bad mod by any stretch, but it doesn't really make sense on Torment and Agony for a lot of classes. Maybe a Trickster, maybe a Devastator, but I think in most situations, those characters are going to be using different weapons. Again, we're talking about a sidearm here, so it's kind of almost a different beast entirely, because we're not talking about a primary weapon with ammo in the back of our minds. We're not worried about running out of ammo, so it is kind of a different beast.
Yeah, and it's great that the 2 mods, though, out of most of these weapons, these 2 really do synergize well together. You know, so you're reloading, you're proccing that effect in between the reloads, right? So they really play off well together, but it being a tier 1 mod, you're likely going to replace it later on with something that's better, like a better version of it. I think where this tier 3 mod really comes into play is if you think I'm putting in something like a sniper rifle later on, right? Those things can have really high damage values on their base shots, right? And taking that times 5 damage in between your reloads, when sniper rifles often have that drop in DPS when you're reloading, that could help make up for that kind of little bit of damage gap there. So it could end up being a very good mod for high damage weapons, but we just don't know until we can play with the modding system.
Right, especially if a single shot sniper rifle does, say 200 damage and you get 5 times that. I mean, you're talking about a sizable one-shot build just by reloading your weapon. So there's a lot of potential there. It just doesn't quite work on the pistols themselves, even though the pistols, and I do want to talk about this, are decent in both trash mobs, elite enemies, and bosses. It works well in all situations because it's not dependent on killing, it's just dependent on using the weapon effectively against targets and then reloading, which is kind of interesting. All right, so moving up the list here, we've got another C tier weapon, and that is the Migraine. Now, the Migraine's tier 3 mod is Ultimate Bleeding Bullets, and if you go into the guides for Outriders, you'll see that the bleed effect is not what you think it is in standard games. The target actually has to be moving for the bleed status effect to be doing any damage. That's the same as if it was on a player. Now, that is not great considering that most targets, once they're in position, are static. So are you really getting a lot of benefit from that tier 3 bleed? Probably not. The other problem with this gun is the tier 2 mod, Bombs Ahead, which is kind of like the Pyromancer Living Bomb Anomaly Bomb ability. Decent when you get a killing shot, it's going to kind of turn, fly up into the air and explode. That's a good effect, but for whatever reason, the Ultimate Bleeding Bullets and the Bombs Ahead mod are working against each other, and I think a lot of us know, if you played the demo, that there's something off with this gun, which is why right now, in its current state, it's at that C tier.
Yeah, they said they are planning a rework to that gun, which, might entirely remove the tier 2 mod that's currently on it, right, to get something else that will work. So with us not really knowing where that kind of sits, it does kind of sit down in that C tier, but I think the reason that we like the bleed also to a degree is because I think bleed is one of the highest damaging, one of the best damaging dots in the game in terms of like coming from your anomaly power, if I'm not mistaken. Being able to proc that without a internal cooldown is kind of a big thing, right? Ultimate Bleeding Bullets having no cooldown versus other mods that might have a cooldown is a big deal. So if you're putting that mod onto something like, an LMG, like I said before, where you want to apply status effects, having all those bullets to just spray the field and put bleed on everything that's running at you, that seems pretty good.
Right, and I want to be clear, I don't want people to think that the mod itself is just terrible outright. It is good, but you have to understand how bleed works in the game. And again, go into the guides and read about the different status effects, and you'll see that bleed is important to understand because it's not traditional in the sense that you bleed a target and they just, drop, HP. It's just not how it works in this game. So it is important to understand that. But it's an okay weapon, right at that C tier, middle of the pack, and hopefully with the rework, it'll bounce up again.
Going from the C tier, we're going to go up to the B tier now. And from here, we'll start with the Iceberg. It has a tier 3 mod called Winter Blast, and critical shots from this weapon create an icy blast that inflicts freeze on enemies within a 4-meter radius, right? So this, anytime you land a crit, you're just going to hit them, and freeze everything around them, which, let's be real, like you put this thing, even if it's not on a sniper, on any other type of weapon, this is really good crowd control. Now keep in mind, crowd control effects, in my opinion, definitely rank down a little bit because don't forget, the more you use a crowd control ability against like elite targets or bosses, the less effective they become, right? And eventually they build up status resistance. So if you're trying to like make your builds and abilities time out to make sure you interrupt like the enemy's abilities and spells and stuff like that, right? You do not want to be just immediately bursting that status meter, because you'll cause problems for your team, interrupting effects that might just like wipe your entire team or revive the field of enemies. Like there could be some big problems with that. So it's knowing when you need to use that effect versus just spamming it, right?
Yeah, and that tier 2 mod kind of plays right off of that, where killing shots against frozen enemies make them explode, dealing X amount of damage. Of course, that damage number is going to change based on some of the crafting factors. It's not bad. Obviously, killing shots are more dependent on like trash mobs and elite, encounters, so not a lot of viability there with boss fights unless there is, trash ads alongside the boss. But it does play nicely off of Winter Blast, where you're freezing everything. Of course, this weapon does it's even more effective in the hands of a Technomancer, where there's other avenues to freeze enemies. So there's a lot of viability here, but it has to be used in the right scenario. It's not great in a solo environment. It's much better in a co-op environment, mainly because snipers in general, while you can use them solo, just play better when you have a full team of 3. So I think you're going to see a lot more viability there. And it is a good weapon, which is why it's that B tier. You've got high damage, you've got some interesting mods, they work well together. I think it's a decent package. It's not the complete package, but it's a decent package.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a pretty all-around, well-crafted, legendary. You'll be happy to get this one to drop and use it straight out of the gate, right?
All right, so moving up to the Airy Master. This is another B tier weapon, really interesting pump action shotgun in the breach variant. I want to make sure that's very clear because it's the only weapon of the shotgun variety that we've seen in the demo that is in a breach variant, which does change things up quite a bit. But it's really that tier 3 mod that I'm interested in. That's weightlessness. Your shots inflict time rift on enemies, and time rift raises the enemy into the air for 5 seconds. It's a really cool mod on the wrong gun, in my opinion. Yes, you can get up close to enemies, but you've only got 3 shots to lift them into the air. There's just a little bit of a disconnect there. It's still very good, and I want to be clear, it is very good, but there's just a little bit of a disconnect, and I can see this mod being much more effective on another weapon. Obviously, you have to consider that there's going to be an internal cooldown on weightlessness. If you throw that on an LMG, you really can't expect every enemy that you hit to be floating in the air. There's just no way the developers are going to let that happen. At launch day, we're going to see more about these tooltips. We're going to get expanded tooltips, so we will actually know what the internal cooldown of weightlessness is. But it's a really interesting mod, and it plays well with the tier 2 mod, Critical Point, which increases your chance of scoring a critical shot by 15%. Now, Livid and I had a conversation about this before, Livid, and maybe you can clarify to people how this mod actually works, because I was unclear, and Livid helped me kind of clarify it.
What it's doing is it's increasing your chance overall to score a critical. Now, if you're shooting things in the head, you're basically guaranteed a critical shot or like a weak point on an enemy. Those are always like guaranteed crits, right? So snipers want to be hitting headshots. Weapons, you just in general want to be hitting headshots. What happens is, I'm pretty sure your base level crit is like 0% on bodies. You're not going to get lucky and get a random crit on a body unless you start leveling into crit chance, right? So the chance of scoring a critical shot by 50% essentially makes this weapon now able to get a 50% chance of scoring a crit when you're just hitting them in the body. It's not great. It's not a super high amount. 15% of up from 0 is not crazy amount. You're not going to see that much of a difference, right? And if they're floating in the air, you're already kind of trying to look at their head. So it just seems kind of like a redundant mod that I don't think you'll find much use out of in most cases. And then the other thing that I just wanted to talk about is the weightlessness mod. Don't forget that Time Rift is an ability that the Trickster gets, right? So this is a mod that you can place on other characters or even on the Trickster himself on different weapons to enable that 4th ability to be active at a time, right? So that does not need to be on your hotbar now. You can have 3 other damaging abilities, and this could be your form of CC for your class built into your weapon. So it opens up avenues for you to really have a more of a power spike, because I think abilities in the long run might have a higher threshold of damage than say just the weapons themselves. You just have more options with that, right? So I think that's a really, really important thing to watch out for on some of these tier 3 mods, the ability for them to become, augmented abilities that you can use on a much lower cooldown on a weapon.
And this gun itself is very good in both single player and co-op builds. It's really the variant that's going to limit you. Only having 3 shots before you have to reload is going to be a little restricting in solo play, but both of those mods are decent. Again, it's a B tier item, so it's not a bad item by any stretch, but there is some just disjunction with it. Some things don't quite line up, and that's why it doesn't get any higher on the list.
Next, I think we're going to move up to the A tier. And the first one that I think we should talk about is Thunderbird. And I think everybody who's played with this weapon has pretty thoroughly enjoyed this one, right? It has a tier 3 mod that's called Ultimate Storm Whip. And shots from this weapon will bring down lightning on an enemy, dealing, X amount of damage. We'll see that increase over time as we get higher level weapons. And the really cool thing about this is it doesn't seem to be on that long of an internal cooldown. I generally see this lightning striking like every 0.5 to 1 second, right? So it's extra damage. It's just coming down as you're hitting your targets. And this synergizes really well with its tier 2 mod, Striga. And this is 30% of critical damage is returned to you as health, which is awesome. So if you're aiming for the head and you're just getting tons of lightning procs and you're also regaining health, it's a really good sustain weapon, but also a really good DPS weapon, right? So I think this works really well on things like trash mobs. It works great on elites. It works great on bosses. It's just all around like a really solid package, and it's only on a standard variant of the rifle. We don't know what the other ones really are or how they'll perform, but right now this one seems very, very strong.
Yeah, I think across the board, this is just the most vanilla, cookie cutter, great weapon all around for all types of players. If you're new to the game and you're looking for a legendary and you don't want to have to think too hard, this is the one you're going to want, because there's just not a lot of room to mess up. You're going to get extra damage from that Ultimate Storm Whip. You're going to get health back from Striga on top of the way that your particular class heals. I mean, it's a win-win across the board. And both of those mods, even if you strip them off the Thunderbird, could be useful on other weapons to make those kind of foolproof weapons. It's a really cool introduction to kind of I guess how crafting could work in the game, because you've got really simple, easy to understand mods that together create a decent weapon. And I really like that. That's why it gets the A tier. All right, moving on up to Rarog's Gaze. This is a really interesting weapon. One of the more fun weapons to use, in my opinion. It's a rifle in the standard variation. So semi-automatic, you've got 8 rounds in a clip. It's a good weapon all around, but it's when you talk about these mods where you start to understand why this weapon is so special at that A tier, and it's Weakness Trap. Shots cause explosions, dealing X amount of damage and inflicting weakness on enemies within a 5-meter radius of the target. Now, you first have to understand what weakness is. Now, weakness decreases the damage dealt by the enemy by 30% for 6 seconds. So what you're basically doing is you're applying this weakness on the enemies and they're doing less damage to you. That is huge. That is a very strong effect. It's not vulnerability. It's not making you do more damage to an enemy, but it's making that enemy do less damage to you. And that's really valuable for boss fights. It's really valuable for monster hunts. It's really valuable for pretty much any situation, as long as you're accurate. When it comes to rifles, you have to be accurate.
And I think this kind of, in a way, is really nice for those players that want to be a more supporty role, right? Because this lets you sit back and do the damage that you want to do, but you're also, if you're contributing to all your frontline players, making sure they're just not taking a lot of damage. So it's a really good mod in a lot of different weapons for that playstyle. I don't think it's really good for like a really DPSing playstyle, right? If you really focus on just doing damage, that's not the mod that you're looking for. But for supporting your teammates in like a co-op setting, this is fantastic. And I think the tier 1 mod that it also has on it is really good for augmenting that support playstyle. It's got a Burning Bullets tier 1 mod. Now it's not the longest duration, or shortest cooldown mod right here. It's an 8-second cooldown, but it inflicts burn on your targets. And burn does a pretty sizable chunk of DPS for a dot. I'm pretty sure it is the highest one. I think it's like 3.7% of your anomaly power is what factors into this. So once again, it works really well on a support type build that you're applying that to, different enemies. I'd replace this with something, like the better version of the Burning Bullets that has like no cooldown, but this is the one that we get on here.
Yeah, I think Rarog's Gaze, the 2 mods don't necessarily work in perfect harmony with each other. I think it's a decent legendary that dropped in the demo that we got a taste of how that, weakness effect worked. But I do think that, like Livid said, you could change out that T1 mod and put something on there that either leans harder into that utilitarian support role, or you could go towards the more DPS role, but you'd have to kind of rework how that rifle is aligned, whether it be with the variant or by putting a different mod on there. It's a decent weapon. Don't get me wrong. It's in that A tier. It's clearly good, but there is still something, just a little something holding it back from reaching that S tier.
So we're going to move on to the last one in the A tier. And I think this is one Cody and I have definitely had probably the most debate on in terms of where it should fall. And it would be Golem's Limb, right? The main thing that really contributes to our discussion here is its tier 3 mod, Golem Rising. Now, killing shots grant you a protective golem effect for 3 seconds. And if you don't know what this does, if you haven't really played the Devastator, it gives you the 65% damage resistance for 3 seconds. Now, this procs every single time you kill a mob. That's kind of big, right? It allows you to have this on a much shorter cooldown and proccing it much more often while maybe keeping up like 3 damaging effects, right, on your actual hotbar of skills. So it allows you to get rid of that defensive skill that you might need and still have it, on a weapon. Now, the downside to this is you have to kill things to get that effect. If you're going up against a boss, this mod is absolutely useless, and you'd be better off having your hotbar slotted with that ability. So that's you can see some really interesting trade-offs that the developers have put in between why this would be on a weapon and why this would be on your character itself. It's nice because it makes players have to actually make that decision between the mod or the ability, which is really cool. And you can also toss this on something like a Trickster, right? And the Trickster runs with shields. And if you kill an enemy with the shotgun with this mod on there, you now get 65% damage resistance on top of having a shield, meaning your shields last even longer.
Yeah, there's a lot of utility here, no doubt about that, but it really is that killing shots grant you these things, Golem Rising and Vampire, the tier 2 mod, that kind of held me back from wanting to push this higher. It's a utility gun, absolutely giving you kind of that defensive boost, but everything is dependent on if you are the one getting those killing blows. And in a group, that may not always happen, and on boss fights and elite enemies, well, are you going to be seeing a lot of benefit? Maybe. It depends on the boss fight or the elite encounter, but for the most part, I think in those high pressure situations, you're just going to end up with a shotgun in your hand when you could be using something else. And that's, like Livid said, that's where we had a little bit of a disagreement on this weapon. It is a fantastic gun, do not get me wrong, but there is definitely just a little bit, depending on your mindset, that's going to either hold you back from loving this weapon or, like Livid, just absolutely loving this weapon because of what it provides the player.
Yeah, it gives you a lot of different options. It gives you a good options to play around. And I think that's the really important thing in this game is, do the players have multiple avenues to experiment with builds? And I think this is a really good case of that happening.
All right, so moving right along to the S tier, the top 2 guns, in our opinion, from the demo, I want to start with Voodoo Matchmaker. Now, a lot of you guys may not enjoy this weapon because it's not super flashy, but you cannot deny that this is not a fantastic gun. That tier 3 mod, Ultimate Damage Link, shots link up to 2 enemies sharing 30% of the weapon damage dealt and 10% of the anomaly damage dealt. This is just a great way to add more damage to more targets on the field, and it's a fantastic weapon in solo encounters, it's a fantastic weapon in group encounters, it's fantastic for trash mobs and elite encounters when there are multiple enemies. I will admit this weapon is not perfect when you're in a boss fight, but it's that tier 1 mod, Vulnerability Bullets, that really matters. Shots inflict vulnerability on your enemies, and vulnerability increases the damage an enemy receives by 25% for 10 seconds. Now that is absolutely huge, and as Livid can talk about, I mean, when you're thinking about how to get through something faster, thinking with an endgame mentality, I mean, vulnerability is going to be key for that, right?
Yeah, vulnerability, I think, is going to be one of the mods that in any co-op group setting that you're running like those expeditions at the highest level, you are going to have one player at the very minimum running vulnerability on some weapon, right? Maybe not the tier 1 version because it has a cooldown, but there is a T3 variant out there that has no cooldown. So you could just proc that thing infinitely and make sure enemies are always taking more damage. So this is like a very key mod for early game all the way up to late game, right? So I think the overall combination between these two things really makes this a solid weapon at any tier that you get it. And you just have to do a little bit of tweaking to make it even better.
And again, it's not a super flashy weapon, but sometimes the best weapons in games like this aren't flashy. They're very viable in most scenarios, and that's what I think we're talking about here with Voodoo Matchmaker.
So the last one that we're going to talk about, and it's also S tier, is Amber Vault. This thing has a tier 3 mod called Killing Spree, and killing shots increase the damage by 30% for this weapon for 30 seconds. And the bonus, and I think it stacks up to five kills, if I'm not mistaken, right?
5 kills, yep.
Yeah, so this allows you to, as you're killing trash mobs, you start getting a rapidly stacking bonus, which gets up to what, 150%, right? Damage boost on this weapon. And couple this with its tier 2 mod, which is an insanely good tier 2 mod. Like, this thing is almost like tier 3 worthy, right? Brain Eater. Critical shots, they just don't consume ammo. So if you're landing headshots, which are crits by the way, and you have this damage amp, which is doing even more damage, you are not only not running out of ammo, but you are just constantly pumping DPS into a target. So right away, those two combinations on something like this double gun, which is, I'm pretty sure, one of the highest firing rate weapons in the game, right? You're just pumping out damage.
Yeah, it's a fantastic weapon across the board. You've got a large clip size so that you can keep working on that killing spree buff. Of course, Brain Eater is just a no-brainer because critical shots not consuming ammo means more ability to fire bullets, and that's huge. And the double gun weapon type is an interesting choice here, and I think it makes it a more viable option. I think if this was on a rifle, it wouldn't be as good, but because you're getting a lot of bullets to use to kill enemies, and killing spree is so damn valuable, we mathed it out, and if you max this out at 5 kills, 5 stacks, you're basically going to be doing 40 damage per shot, and that is fantastic, and that's just what we were experiencing at the demo level. So imagine this once you get the weapon level up. I mean, you're just going to be absolutely running shop with the Amber Vault with both of these mods, and honestly, I may not even change anything. It's one of those guns that, sure, I may experiment with, but the setup right now is fantastic.
Yeah, the setup on this weapon is amazing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this weapon, I think, in any regard. And not only that, but like, you could take this mod off, and both these mods, right? You could take these mods off, and they are great on a lot of different weapons in the game. So it's a great item to dismantle for its mods. It's a great item to use just for encounters. It's good against trash mobs. It's good against bosses for its, infinite ammo, essentially. It's just all around great.
So what did you guys think about our breakdown of the legendary weapons in the Outriders demo? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you are interested in hearing our thoughts on all of the legendaries in the game, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content. We've got a lot of Outriders videos planned. We'd love your support. You can also join us on Discord. We've got a great community of over 6,000 members, and around 400 of those members are in there just for Outriders. So check out that link below and join today. My name is Codiak.
And my name is Livid.
Thanks for watching, and play on.